Howdy everyone, welcome to another episode of Devlogs. I am continuing to make progress on my senior project, this time with having a submenu appear upon clicking the settings button on the title screen. As I add more and more interactive possibilities, we'll find ourselves with a nice amount of sound possibilities to implement into a title scene, which I am excited to show later. I have also started with composing the title theme and have a very short snippet of an idea for a pickup measure I wanted to pull off on the VRC6 sound chip. Here's a snippet of that. That's it for that, and we're jumping straight into lesson 4 of the 201 certification. We have importing a MIDI file, connecting MIDI tracks to a synthesizer, editing synth properties, using the same synthesizer with multiple music tracks, configuring a sampler, and setting up a multi-sampled instrument. I am gonna be honest with y'all, I do not use MIDI and apologize to those of you who shuddered upon hearing that. I have always used the keyboard keys when I compose, and I won't take the time to delve in on why, unless someone comes to me lacking sleep because they need an answer. That being said, I have learnt about and dabbled with MIDI in classes, meaning I possess an understanding of it. So for those of you who are MIDI lovers, you'll be happy to know that Wwise supports not only WAV files of a MIDI performance, but the rendered MIDI files themselves in a Wwise project. We're going to go over this with the boss music provided to us in the 4th lesson. This will come in its own playlist container in the Lesson 4 Wwise project file. Amidst these music segments, there are MIDI synthesizer parts that need to be imported for the Boss A and Boss C music segments. We are going to import the MIDI sequence files for the Boss A music segment first. Reiterating off of what I said before, these are not audio files, rather the MIDI sequence, which is something that can be imported into Wwise. When I import these, they will be imported as music tracks. The first big difference you will see is that in the music segment editor, the MIDI tracks display their musical information in a different format. Compared to what you see at the top of the music segment editor, the MIDI files display the note pitches and lengths for the MIDI information, rather than the waveform data. Despite being able to see the note data in the MIDI tracks, you will notice that when I solo one of these tracks, we will not be able to hear it. This is because the MIDI files need to be given to something that can translate its data into sound. A method we can use to get sound for these MIDI tracks is to connect them to the Synth1 plugin offered by Wwise. Now, Synth1 is a source plugin, and is something that will get referenced by the MIDI track in order to procure an audible interpretation of the track. And so we need to create an object to configure the Synth1 plugin in, allowing us to reference it. I'll do this by creating an SFX object, which can be done in the actor mixer hierarchy. This object is being used for music specifically, so I am going to create a work unit named music to help with categorization. Once I have made and named an SFX object in the music work unit, I will add a source, which will be Synth1. When I play this object, a high frequency plays, but we need for this to not play a frequency set by whatever is in its properties. We want for it to read the notes on the MIDI track. To do this, I go to frequency mode in the SFX object's contents editor, and I set the mode to MIDI note. The frequency that plays now is lower, which does not matter because when we connect this to the track, it will begin reading and playing the data. To assign a target for Synth1 to interpret, I will jump back to the interactive music hierarchy, open the Boss A music segment's property editor, and we need to add a tab to the property editor view, specifically the MIDI one. I do so by clicking the plus sign to the right of all the existing tabs, then tick off the checkbox that says MIDI. Now, a MIDI tab is in view. When I look at the MIDI properties for one of the tracks, you'll notice it has no assigned MIDI target. I'll change this by clicking Override Parent, then assigning the Arpeggio Synth Sound SFX object as the target. Now watch what happens when I play the track. The synth sounds you just heard are default and most definitely need some tweaking, so we're going to do that. To edit the synth properties, I'll go back to the contents editor for the Arpeggio Synth SFX object. I do this by reopening the actor mixer hierarchy and selecting it. Then in the contents editor, I will double-click the plugin icon to open its properties. Listen as I make adjustments to some of the properties. The synth property editor is similar to any other synth interface you may have edited on, which is nice, and so playing around with it is a pretty easy thing to do. However, the lesson talks about expanding on editing the sound and moves on to envelopes, which is a separate process for setting up. In the property editor for the synth, we are going to move to the RTPC tab. Here, we can edit the volume envelope for our synth. Listen as I play with the properties. At this point, the Arpeggio synth track sounds pretty cool. We're going to edit the melody track next and, in the process, mess with the LFO property to create vibrato, which is appropriate for the sustained notes. Since these properties are for the melody in particular, I'm going to copy-paste the Arpeggio synth object and rename the duplicate Melody Synth. I will assign Melody Synth to the Melody MIDI track, giving it identical properties to the Arpeggio synth. We are going to begin changing the melody object's properties to differentiate it from the Arpeggio synth. Listen as I go through previously used tabs for the changes I make. So that part of the editing process you've seen. But now we're going to jump into the RTPC tab and begin editing the LFO. LFO, or low frequency oscillator, is a parameter that needs to be added in order for us to edit. First, I need to assign the oscillator we want to affect by assigning it to the y-axis. I choose oscillator 1 transpose. For the x-axis, we will be transposing LFO for vibrato purposes. This is a modulator that can be used for other instruments in the future, and so it will get added to the modulations folder in the project's share set hierarchy. I will name it Synth Vibrato. The RTPC graph now displays a pink line representing our new property, and when we click this property, can begin editing various properties. We're going to start by dragging the point at the end of the pink line upwards. I'm going to zoom in on the graph by clicking the plus icon and bring the point to the value 150 on the y-axis, which is a measurement for cents. If you don't know that value, it represents pitch, specifically the ratio between two frequencies. By doing this to the pink line, we've made it so that there is a maximum offset the pitch can undergo, 150 cents. I'm going to change the frequency property to 6 and play back the track. So the vibrato is definitely working, though it's a bit too powerful. We need to take into account some qualities of MIDI that have yet to be referenced in our Wwise project. MIDI musicians that are performing on their keyboard frequently use a modulator to change the level of a dynamic that influences their sounds. This modulator, for example, could be a knob that adjusts the depth levels of our vibrato property on the oscillator. This is a continuous control the musician possesses and is something we need to set up in Wwise to account for instances where they used a modulator. All properties that you want to account for in musicians' interactions with their modulators need to be controlled by an RTPC. You can do this by navigating to a property and clicking the RTPC icon to the left of the property's value. I'm going to do this for depth, and upon doing so, the vibrato modulator's editor will pop up. I will assign depth to the y-axis since it is the value we wish to change. Then in the x-axis, click MIDI, CC 0 through 31, and CC number 1 modulation. This corresponds to the physically interactable modulator on the musician's keyboard. And now that it has been assigned a depth, is something that can change if the musician interacted with that reference component during their performance. However, the vibrato, at default, is at a constant maximum, as you can see by the RTPC's line. We need to create a range that responds to the interactions the musician makes with their modulator. I'll drag the left point of the line all the way to the bottom, then change the line type to an exponential curve. When I play back the clip, the track will now take into account the musician's performance and instances where they had interacted with the continuous control component I am referencing from their equipment. Let's take a listen. You can hear that near the end of sustained notes, the modulator was changed to apply vibrato near the end of those sustained notes, which is now being recognized by Wwise thanks to our configured RTPC. That being said, it is possible to change the effect that is changed in accordance to the modulator's changes. We now have 2 synth presets, and as I said near the beginning of this video, we are going to edit the Boss C music segment as well. We do not need to keep creating synth music objects though, unless we have a new instrument idea. But you should also know that a synth object can be assigned to more than one music track. To easily prove this, you'll see that the Boss C music track already has the MIDI files in it, and they have also been specified as arpeggio and melody tracks, like in the Music A segment. Knowing this, I can assign both my SFX objects to these tracks and not have to create a new object, as long as I'm happy with the sound. One thing I do wrong near the end of this clip is that I left the transport view for the Boss A music segment pinned. This made it so that when I hit space to play Boss C's music segment, it was still playing the A segment. After I unpin it, the problem is fixed, so remember to unpin the transport view if you ever do that. We've done a lot with synthesized sounds, but now we're moving on to samples. MIDI tracks can target samples and not just synthesized sound, which is something we will do for the Boss D music segment. The Boss D music segment already has a randomized MIDI track container with 5 different possibilities for when and how the samples are played. For now, I'm going to click the Force Usage button in the random step container to ensure only the top track plays. As referenced in the track's name, the MIDI tracks are intended to reference a sample of the suling instrument, which is a type of bamboo flute from Southeast Asia. I'm going to import a sample of this flute into the music work unit of the actor-mixer hierarchy, which will create a new SFX object that is the sample. I will name it Suling C-sharp 5. When I play it back, you may have guessed the note is C-sharp. Once I assign the sample to the track, I will play it back. Notice how the sample plays only C-sharp, yet the MIDI track shows different note pitches. To fix this, I will go to the MIDI tab in the property editor view of the Suling SFX object, and under Note Tracking, click the Enable checkbox and change the root note to C-sharp at the 5th octave. When I play it back, the track will now take the pitch changes into proper account. The note tracking is a cool feature, but I'm sure you agree that one sample being influenced in such a manner can lead to unnatural sounds, especially when the pitch of the sample is very offset from the root note. The bigger the difference in pitch, the worse the quality of the sample seems to get. To counter this, we are going to set up a multi-sampled instrument to account for different ranges of pitch. Using the filters property in the MIDI tab of each sample, I can determine the minimum and maximum values a note can be offset in pitch. Should the note go beyond that pitch, it will choose a sample that accounts for a pitch outside the defined range. When I set the minimum and maximum values for the first sample in playback, you'll notice that currently the notes outside that range will lack sound. There are a variety of recordings that cover a wide range of the Suling's pitch range, and we want all of these samples in a blend container. I'm going to delete the previously made sample and then import a folder with the samples into the music work unit of the actor-mixer hierarchy. Before importing, I need to make sure not to import the folder as a virtual folder, but rather a blend container. In the MIDI settings, for the blend container, we have the same properties that could be edited for a singular SFX object, but we are going to use the key map editor to see the MIDI properties of all samples without having to jump between each one. I am going to click Override MIDI Note Tracking for each sample, then enable MIDI Note Tracking for each one, followed by defining their root note, which has conveniently been given to us in the file name for each sample. Next up is changing the minimum and maximum values for each sample. The lowest pitch needs a minimum value of the lowest possible note, whereas the highest pitch needs a maximum value that is your highest note possible. Other than that, your minimum values for other samples should be their root note, then the maximum value should be one value under that next sample's root note. Otherwise, you risk two samples playing at once. Once done, I need to reassign a target to the music track and reference the blend container. Now I can play back and hear the change, but before I do, I will show the changes in the profiler layout so that you can see when a different sample is chosen that fits one of the pitch ranges we've defined. And that was the end of Lesson 4. I was pretty impressed and did not realize how in touch Wwise got with the composition side of a soundscape, but let me know what you thought about this lesson. If you are a MIDI musician, I am especially curious to hear your thoughts as to what I just shared and hope my breakdown made sense. That's all for today though. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.